It was finalised on the 14th of April, and then for me, I had to read it and get legal advice. That was actually the first thing I had to do. I started engagement with Mr Kelly on the 26th of April on foot of that advice, and then there was a series of correspondence between myself and Mr Kelly. So I wrote on the 26th of April, he replied on the 10th of May. There was letters over and back throughout the end of April, May into June. I think the concern for us at that time was that at any point this process could have been injuncted. So the report could have been injuncted up until this week. So legally we had to be careful. We had put a lot of work had gone into this, and in terms of the responses being received from Mr Kelly, we were being threatened with legal action. So that process continued until the most recent letter that I received from Mr Kelly was on the 22nd of June, and prime time aired on the 23rd. So there was a series of engagement with Mr Kelly throughout from the time I received the report, basically advising him that I was very concerned that under the arrangement that we had with them, there appeared to be a breach of the arrangement, and ultimately saying that the HSE had the right, therefore, to cease funding and, if necessary, to seek repayment of funds used for purposes not agreed by the HSE. And that was the tenor of the conversation. I think the responses from Mr Kelly were not satisfactory at any point during that process.
Now, Ms O'Connor, I hear what you're telling me. Did you call a meeting of the Audit Committee, and do you sit on that Audit Committee yourself?
I sit as a nominee of the Directors on the Audit Committee.
So you actually sit on that committee, and did it occur to you during that time to call an Audit Committee meeting, and we have a serious problems on our hand here?
No, because it was actually an issue in terms of the management of the relationship with Console at that time. There was no question that the audit had highlighted serious concerns. So actually it was about the management of the situation.
Well, Ms O'Connor, I have difficulty with that now, the management of the situation, because we're in the bizarre situation here where we have this report and we can't go into it, but we can use it in terms of holding you to account, the Health Executive. And there are, I keep forgetting the number of findings, 60. There are 60 findings. It's already been highlighted. No, findings. 60 findings. And it's already been highlighted by my colleague on the right. All of the findings in this audit have a high rating, and many have national implications for the Health Executive. Okay? At the back of the document, we have 89 recommendations. And of those 89 recommendations, only 4 are directed to the Health Executive. 85 are directed to the very person who was, one has to be careful here, who caused the audit to be had in the first place. And you're directing 85, this audit is directing 85 recommendations to that very person and that company. And these implications, red alert. Did that not lead you or any of your colleagues to call an urgent meeting?
I think in terms of the response, I mean, the internal audit have a particular function to produce the report, which they did, and it then gets brought to a service division. So that's to me in respect of mental health.
I have only 10-15 minutes to ask a question, and my question is very specific. Did it not occur to you or any of your colleagues to call an urgent meeting in relation to the 60 findings and the 89 recommendations, and where you were going as a Health Executive in relation to that?
I guess in terms of my response, it's the management talking to the Director General about the actions to respond to the audit report. The audit report will be discussed by the Audit Committee at a meeting on Monday. And the National Director of Internal Audit will be presenting the findings of the report to the committee. Well,
I have to say, I believe that is a totally inadequate response, and we're reliant on RTE and the programme that exposed this, because when I read this, and I make the same comment as my colleague on the right that's in his contribution, I actually wrote down here, as I read it, have the Health Executive grasped the nature of the problem? That's actually my comment here in relation to the 89 recommendations, and with only 4 directed to the Health Executive and the other 85 directed to the person and the body that you had been working with for over a year, that led you on a merry dance in a sense by going to this office, going to that office. Did alarm bells not ring?
Perhaps, first of all, if it would be helpful, the person who prepared the report could explain why recommendations are made in the way they are.
Yes, Deputy. These recommendations arose from the specific findings in Console. As is normal in an audit report, we actually address the recommendations to the particular issue. Now, Console is certainly a unique case, I think, as we see. We don't know what, at the time of preparing the report, we don't know what the outcome is with Console. These recommendations will actually, as the Director General has identified, will actually feed into the learning process for HSE in terms of its annual compliance process with the various agencies. So whilst, as I say, they are addressed to the CEO of Console, and Console is now no longer, those recommendations do not die. Those recommendations will be taken on by our National Compliance Office in terms of informing their learning and their interaction with various agencies. And just if I can say that some of those issues have already been taken on board by the National Compliance Office. So this is there is a lot of learning from this report.
Dr. Smith, it's beyond learning at this point. 89 recommendations addressed to a body that's not cooperating in any way, and you're sitting here today before the Public Accounts Committee telling us that this is learning. Now, I have the greatest respect for the Health Executive and the services they're trying to provide, but there was an abject failure to grasp what was going on. And my question really now at this point is, I believe you made a decision that you couldn't do without Console, and that the helpline was necessary and the services provided, and you turned a blind eye. And in fact...
Sorry, I have to object to that.
Well, then, that's okay. You can object to it and I will take it back.
Well, let me be clear.
Just let me finish my sentence.
Certainly.
That's what it seems to me. I take it back if I'm insulting you in any way, but it seems to me a decision was made on value for money, to use your own words, and that they were given value for money with the amount of money they were giving, and the rest you could work on it in the future. You were fully intending to work with this body. Sorry now, I see head shaking. You were fully intending to work with this body. 84 recommendations were addressed to this body to help the body improve. So you had no intention, from what I can see, and correct me if I'm wrong, to stopping this process until RTE acted and other events happened that capitulated the whole situation. So my question is that you were letting, for value for money, for practical reasons, this body was going to continue.
No, that is completely and utterly wrong. And I'll explain to you why, in order to convince you that the preliminary conclusion you've reached is wrong. First of all, the matters that arose and were identified by internal audit were brought to the Garda Bureau of Fraud Investigation in February of this year. Point one. Point two, while we're satisfied that while the agreement continued, we had been obtaining value for money, and were concerned to ensure that by one means or another, we now know what that other means is, these services would continue to be available to clients, which obviously has to be a primary concern of ours. The only reason why we had to go through the sequential steps is because that is the appropriate process for bringing an internal audit to conclusion. I give you an example of how the Controller and Auditor General conducts his work, or any auditor. They reach their preliminary findings. They give the person against whom those findings are made an opportunity to comment, and that is the normal process. When this came to the National Director of Mental Health, her concern was to ensure that this audit report and her ability to act on it was not in any way compromised, and she had to follow appropriate procedure and give the organisation, with all that we know about it, an opportunity to make submissions to her before she reached her final decision. And that final decision undoubtedly would have been to withdraw funding from this organisation and to move services elsewhere, something that was already well under consideration long before prime time. And just to be clear, without the internal audit, there would have been no prime time programme. So there's absolutely no foundation to suggest that we were sitting back and saying, oh, we're getting great value for money, we'll let Console to continue. There's absolutely not one single shred of evidence to support that contention.
Mr O'Brien, that may well be your view, but there are 89 recommendations and 84 of them are in relation to working with the very body that we see now in the courts. That's number one.
No,
number two, just let me finish now. I listened to you.
I really need to answer this.
I listened to you. I didn't interrupt you. I didn't interrupt. Number two, this report says that Console had charity status. I understand that they didn't have charity status going back to June of last year. Is that correct?
Well, I can say, according to its audited financial statements for 2014, it had charity status.
So you can't clarify for me whether I'm wrong or right that they didn't have charity status from June of last year.
No, all I know is what I've read in the media.
What did you read in the media?
Well, in relation to the revenue commissioners,
yes.
during the week, I think it said that it had withdrawn the charity status.
So you weren't aware of that?
No.
Okay. That in itself is extraordinary. In relation to Garda clearance, what is your policy in relation to Garda clearance?
Garda clearance of the internal audit report, or
Garda clearance of workers working for Console and the CEO and so on.
You wanted to respond to a comment just a minute ago.
I think that an awful lot is being made of the fact that there are recommendations in the internal audit report that relate to the organisation. Important to understand that is absolutely standard practice. Those are matters that could only be remedied by the organisation. And any internal audit report that you would find into any organisation, whether it's a funded organisation or not, will have the bulk of its recommendations typically addressed to the people who run that organisation. Internal audit doesn't have a role in deciding whether we continue to fund Console, doesn't have an opinion on it. It does its work, and if it believes there are recommendations that should be made to the board of an organisation, continuing or not, it will make those recommendations. So there's nothing about that that relates to any thought process about whether Console would continue or not.
Accept that, and that's why I started off originally asking the question of Miss O'Connor why a decision wasn't made to call the audit committee. I asked you why alarm bells didn't ring, and so you're not answering those, and you're going back into the process. Now, on top of that, what were the national implications arising from the 60 findings for the health executive? What were they?
Well, they're spelled out in the recommendations.
No, they're not actually. Sorry now. They're not. What are 60 findings, and at the bottom, all the findings in this audit have a high rating, and many have national implications. What are those national implications? How many are there? What have you done about it?
The national implications arise from the recommendations which emanate from those findings. And as I've mentioned, those recommendations will feed into the process that our National Compliance Office engages in with the various agencies. And essentially what this is, we're saying, look, these issues, this is what we have found in Console. Here's what we are recommending. The national implications are that HSE need to look at this and think this is not solely Console. What can we learn from this process? So they're the potential national implications.
Okay. I think my time is drawing to a close. Just in relation to service level agreements, there were service level agreements. Were there in place between Console? Was that answered, and did I miss it? Yes. There were. Okay. And under those service level agreements, it allowed you, if you had concerns, to go in and inspect all documents at any premises. Isn't that right?
Pardon. Sorry, my apologies.
Under the service level agreements, one of them which I read, you were allowed in at any time to inspect documents, to go into the premises of Console, and you had full power to do that under your service level agreement. Did you not?
It's never a power we've exercised.
No.
With all our funded organisations, we have a set of documents that we require the organisations to submit to us, and that they do each year as part of their business relationship with us.
Okay. You see, the reason I'm asking this really is not to put you on the spot, but to try and understand what's happened. And here we have, my colleague has just passed me the grant aid agreement, and paragraph 7.5 2013. The organisation will permit the executive reasonable access to the organisation's premises and so on, and shall permit the executive to carry out inspections of same. Now, why I'm highlighting that is the power was there. You said you haven't used it. And then you go through a process of an internal audit. And to put it mildly, cooperation wasn't forthcoming. Isn't that correct? And you're saying that. I'm not talking about Console. That's what you're saying. Cooperation wasn't forthcoming.
I think I suppose the power of the executive, as you referenced, is what we use when we ask internal audit. So internal audit invoked that power effectively by going in and doing a full examination. So it was at the request of NOSP that internal audit went in and sought access to records.
Well, just on that, I don't accept that it was your good skill and detective work in 2013 that led to this. I believe that there were many concerns prior to this, and some of them been highlighted. You've not dismissed, but you've dealt with the woman that wrote the letter, and that was nothing to do with governance, it was counselling. Then we move forward to the PA, and the Department of Health have clarified that they didn't pass that information on to you. So that's the second alert. But you also, following Deputy McSharry, you said you clarified that somebody went into Console back in 2009, I think. So at that stage you had concerns, serious concerns.
No,
you didn't?
No, I think what Mr. Raleigh reflected was the fact that a person who at that time was employed by the HSE of their own volition applied for a post advertised by Console, got that, and applied to be able to return to the HSE at the end of that period, and that was granted.
Okay.
They weren't sent in by the HSE.
I understand that, but Deputy McSharry has raised concerns there. I won't repeat them in what he did or did not say when he went back, or what she may not or may have asked.
Yeah, but I think he may have taken the point that we'd sent the person in, and we hadn't.
Well, what I want to finish off with is, how could you have been satisfied in 2009, or whichever year you gave, that you were satisfied with governance, when this was a family run? You told the committee that somewhere 9 or 8 or 9 that you were satisfied with governance. How could you have been satisfied with governance at that point?
Did we tell the committee that?
Well, I think in terms of what happened, a series of meetings were held and the measures that were requested by NOSP at that time were put in place. Again, the funding at that time was in the grant aid agreement territory of about 250,000. It was less than what we went to in 2013, but the agreement, I mean, there were a series of performance meetings with Console at that time.
They may well have been, but did you check who was sitting on the board, who was the CEO, was there a conflict of interest? Did you check any of that, or ask questions how they were receiving money when this was a charity and they appeared to have received payments with different names on it? How did you satisfy yourself about it?
I think the specific issues that were raised at the time, again, none of us here were present at those meetings, but the specific issues, as we understand it from a previous director, were addressed then with the organisation. I suppose the standing measure that was put in place was a limit on their funding, so there was no increase in funding for a number of years, despite the organisation's request for increased funding.
There was an increase in funding in 13.
In 13, but prior to that, between 2000
in 14, when you were fully aware it went up. In 14,
that was the full year. So what happened in 2013 was the helpline funding was allocated for a half year from July to December. The increase in 14 is just the full year effect of that.
And what did they get in 15?
In 15, they got 671,000.
Thank you, Chair.